So who are Mennonites? When I teach my Intro to Religions class, students often ask me, what religion are you? And I've thought that this is sort of like asking your political science prof, what party are you? Although now I'm starting to think that the way students mean it is more like asking their psychology prof, what disorder are you? But in the interest of full disclosure, I tell them, well, I grew up Mennonite. And I ask them, what do you know about Mennonites? And the students usually respond with things like farmers, conservative, horse and buggy, that sort of thing. So Mennonites are seen as the quiet in the land, an agricultural religious community separate from dominant culture. Mennonites have gained visibility in Canadian popular culture through shows like Pure and Miriam Toews novels. Anybody watch Pure by any chance? It's highly entertaining. While these explore or sensationalize the underside of Mennonite culture, the depictions mostly still trade on assumptions about Mennonites, not the least of which is that Mennonites are idiosyncratic, different from everybody else. Mennonite academics have pushed back at depictions of Mennonites in shows like Pure, mostly because I think they secretly wish they had been hired on as consultants. But Mennonites tend to be treated as a separate stream in history in North America. But what if Mennonites aren't just a bubble contained within a larger sphere of Canadian history? What if instead, Mennonites are an example of an important aspect of our Canadian culture? I'm interested in finding out what Mennonites might reveal about us all as Canadians in particular and North Americans in general. Okay, so which Mennonites? Who are we talking about and why? The Mennonites I'm focusing on are the ones who immigrated to Manitoba from Russia in the 1870s. They thought they were escaping Russian assimilation policies in order to preserve their religious identity. The Dominion told them Canada had plenty of land available and was the best place to escape to. We know now, of course, that this was part of a larger ploy to get white settlers into Canada in order to dispossess Indigenous people of their land. Partly I'm asking, did Mennonites know what was going on? And spoiler alert, they did. But more specifically, I want to find out what they thought of the original inhabitants of their newly acquired land. I want to find out, what do Mennonite accounts of Indigenous people mean for how Canadian settlers have viewed Indigenous people? Fortunately for me, Mennonites wrote everything down. Mennonites wrote journals, diaries, memoirs, family histories, and also had a newspaper that circulated among all the Mennonite communities in North America and Russia, the Mennonitische Rundschau. The Rundschau currently only exists in its original Fraktur German script and has not been translated into English or been the subject of a focused study. It has, however, been indexed. There are over 500 references to Indigenous people from Apache to Yankton Indians, with suggestive and intriguing headlines. Turns out the Mennonites were not quiet at all when it came to Indigenous people. So why am I doing this? What might be gained by learning that Mennonites not only aren't the quiet in the land, but are actually the bellwether of Canadian settler culture? I'm generating knowledge on not just the legal and economic apparatuses of colonialism, but also the cultural. We have here one example of how a religious identity has been formed through its accounts of Indigenous peoples and the land. These narratives intertwine race, religion, and land, which suggests that they are not just separate spheres of influence, but mutually constitutive. In short, Mennonite-Indigenous relations are a case study for understanding how settler understandings of Indigenous people have brokered the connection between religion and land in Canada since the late 19th century. Let me give you a couple examples of what I'm talking about. On the one hand, Mennonites were the first influx of agricultural immigrants onto the Manitoba land over which Métis had rights and on which Métis communities aspire to continue their own way of life. On the other hand, Mennonites were shown hospitality and formed reciprocal relationships with Métis families. One example I found is Elizabeth Delorme, or otherwise known as Mrs. Russell, a Métis woman who could cure cancer. She healed several Mennonites and exchanged remedies with a Mennonite midwife. At the basis of both the tensions and reciprocity is religion and land. On the one hand, we have the promised land and self-preservation. On the other hand, we have medicinal gardens and Christian charity. Here we have two examples of how religion and land were mutually informative and understood through Mennonite-Indigenous relations with very different outcomes. How Mennonites see and interact with Indigenous people makes an important difference for how they understand themselves and engage with the land. Mennonites show how religion, land, and race have been connected in our culture. My overall goal is to generate knowledge that can be used to educate Canadian settlers about the importance of how they perceive Indigenous people for building better settler-Indigenous relations and moving toward decolonization and reconciliation. Thank you.